Okay, it is 2 o'clock. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's event, The Geography of the Cost of Living Crisis. Everywhere across the country is struggling with the cost of living crisis, but some places are being hit more than others. The geography of the crisis tends to be overlooked in much of the analysis and the media commentary. Today, we're going to focus on this perspective, both in terms of what the geography of the problem is, and actually whether there's a particular geography to the solutions that might help places and households address the cost of living problem. And we've got a great panel of speakers to explore these issues in a bit more detail, and I'll introduce them very shortly. Just a few words of housekeeping from me. As always, the event is being recorded and will be made available on our website after the event. If you want to tweet about the event, the hashtag is #OutOfPocket. You can post questions and comments throughout the event. You don't have to wait until you've heard from all our speakers. And you do this via the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. And we'll be done by 3 o'clock. And I'll try to take as many of those questions as I can when we get into that part of the event. So let's get underway. So first off, we're going to have a short presentation from my colleague, Guilherme Rodrigues. He leads on all of our work relating to the geography of the cost of living crisis. After Guilherme, we're going to hear from our three panelists, Councillor Afrasiab Anwar, who's the leader of Burnley Council. Then we're going to hear from Zoe Guijarro, who is the Principal Policy Manager at Citizens Advice, and Paul Swinney, who is the Director of Policy and Research at the Centre for Cities. Each of those will say a few words of intro and reflections based on what Guilherme says in their own engagement in this issue, and then we'll open it up for questions and a bit of a discussion. So without further ado, Guilherme, over to you.
Andrew. So back in July, we released our report Out of Pocket, where we analyzed the geography of the cost of living crisis, where we found that broadly there was a north-south divide in the inflation and the cost of living in the UK. And on the left-hand side of this slide in the map, you can see that that relationship remains when we see at the latest inflation figures that we estimated. Places in the Greater Southeast, most of them you can see green, light green dots, which means that inflation has been below 10%, below the national average. Meanwhile, a lot of places in the Midlands and the North, we see inflation rates much higher than that. For example, Burnley and Blackpool, inflation rate in August was 11.2 and 10.8% respectively. And while in Cambridge and London, inflation rate was still below 9%. And on the table on the right, we can see that inflation rose everywhere from January to August, as we are well aware of. But if we compare, for example, the cities with the highest and lowest inflation rates, so Burnley and London, we can see that the gap between them back in January was 1 percentage point, so 6.1% against 5.1%, while now the gap is widened. So all places are facing higher inflation, but the gap between the north and south has been widening. So we took here, for examples, Blackpool, Burnley, Bristol, and Milton Keynes, and we look at how wages adjusted to inflation have been performing in the last year or so. And we can see that even if there's a north-south divide in the inflation rates, and some places are performing slightly better, these four places, and actually all large towns and cities analyzed in our report, have negative real wage growth at the moment, which means that inflation has been being higher than wage growth since April 2022 for all cities. And in monetary terms, we estimate that a place like Blackpool, wages are £129 lower adjusted to inflation in July 2022 than a year ago, and even in places like Bristol and Milton Keynes, where inflation has not been as high, the monetary cost of inflation for workers has been around £100. So unfortunately, we know that the cost of living crisis is still ongoing. The Bank of England in September forecasted inflation to reach 11% in October. We know that energy prices are going to increase in October with the energy price guarantee to 2,500 a year on average. And this is a policy that was introduced because we know that the cost of living crisis is still ongoing, and some projections from private analysts say that the gas prices can be much higher than previous periods till 2025, 2026. So as this is not just something that's happened till now, we consider it important to see how the energy price guarantee plays a role in our geographies. So we know that the energy price cap it's an average based on several conditions based on consumption. And here again, on the left-hand side, we can see a map with a similar north-south divide as we've seen in the slides before. So again, light green dots are places where we estimate the energy cap after the government's energy price guarantee to be below 2,450. So we have places like Milton Keynes, Crawley, Peterborough, and the benefit of the energy price guarantee is estimated to be slightly below £1,000 a year. On the other side of the spectrum, again, we have places like Bradford, Swansea, and cities in the northwest, like Blackpool and Burnley, where the estimated average energy bill it's significantly above the 2,500 that government estimated as an average, and the impact, the discount from the energy price guarantee, is slightly higher than the other cities, but not enough to offset these differences. And the reason we see this north-south divide in our analysis has to do with energy efficiency of the buildings. So based on available data, we know that to meet the same energy needs and requirements and comfort, houses with different energy certificates will require different consumption levels because of their efficiency. So we know that houses with an energy certificate EPC below level C, they can spend as much as 2 to 3 times as more efficient houses that are between A and C. And this is the reason why we see such a geography. So on the right-hand side on this slide, we can see a map with a distribution of dwellings with an energy stock below C, so the most efficient ones. And again, there's a north-south divide with some exceptions like Southend and Worthing in the south with a relatively inefficient. And even the places with the most efficient dwellings, we are talking about 50% of them being between A, B, and C energy certificate. So by looking at this, we can see that places in the north are facing more inflation, and as energy consumption increases in winter, they are more likely to be affected by the cost of living, the ongoing cost of living crisis. So in the short term, our policy priorities is for government to reintroduce universal credit uplift that did during the pandemic and increase benefits in line with inflation immediately. And as energy needs, because of energy efficiency, are not fully associated with consumption, we believe that the government should give a one-off payment in a similar fashion as it did before with the council tax rebate for households living in the most inefficient dwellings, because they will need to consume more to have the same levels of comfort. And as prices go up, they are the most affected ones. And we know that retrofitting takes time, so this immediate support is very important as other measures in the medium and long term can be taken. So for medium and long term, we need to improve energy efficiency. So far, the government has been very much focused on increasing the supply of energy, discussions about the possibility of fracking, energy market reforms, oil production in the North Sea. But managing the demand by making our consumption more efficient is very important. So on two notes, we have housing. So retrofitting, as we previously discussed in our work, it's very important to make houses more efficient and consume less. And that will boost incomes by reducing the consumption of energy. But also we have in the UK one of the oldest or even the oldest housing stock in Europe. So planning reform is very important to boost construction of new efficient homes. And then we know that cost of living crisis is also, you can be seen in transport. So petrol and fuel, it's more expensive. And it's important to reduce the number of car journeys in the long term, and public transport reforms around revenue and capital support are very important, active travel schemes, and for both housing and transport, we know that cities play a particularly important role. All the data presented here is available in our cost of living tracker, which will be updated tomorrow as national inflation is out. Thank you.
Guilherme, thank you very much indeed for that presentation showing the geography and then beginning to suggest some solutions about how we deal with it. Let's move to our panel. Good afternoon, Councillor. Good to have you with us from Burnley. Sadly or otherwise, our analysis suggests that everywhere is struggling, but this is particularly striking in Burnley. I'd be interested to get your view as to how you're experiencing it, and then we can get into what we might do about it and the role of Burnley and the council more generally. But how is it playing out in Burnley?
Thank you, Andrew. First of all, thank you for the invitation to come and speak and be on the panel this afternoon. I think in terms of everything that we've seen as part of the report and the presentation that we just saw, before I go into that, I think it's important also to mention that obviously prior to this, another report came out from the Centre for Cities, which highlighted that Burnley was, off the back of the pandemic, was the best performing town centre across the country in terms of footfall. And I think that what that goes to show is that actually the work that we're doing as a council in terms of supporting our businesses, supporting our communities, and the investment that we're putting in is having a real impact. So then to see this report come in off the back of that was a little bit disappointing, but also, I'm going to caveat that with, when we talk through the Centre for Cities, we're talking about Burnley and Pendle as the two districts together. So it's important that we note that. But in terms of was I surprised at the information that was presented? No, not at all. And the reason for that is, again, it's been touched on in the report, the two major reasons for the headlines of that report, that Burnley was, in terms of inflation, was the worst affected. And the reasons that were given as part of that, one was the housing stock. And so in Burnley, we have pre-1919, 71% of our housing stock is terraced housing. Majority of that is 2 up, 2 down, terraced housing that are not energy efficient. So that's one of the reasons. And then the other one is the reliance of all of our workforce, all of our residents rely primarily on having to use their cars, whether that's for traveling for work or leisure. So obviously that has a huge impact as well. So you're talking about the transport links and things that might impact there. But what we're failing to recognise as part of that also is that in 2010, as soon as this government came in, what we had prior to that was investment up to, at times, up to £20 million a year of investment through housing market renewal. And what that was doing was actually demolishing some of the terraced housing and actually promoting and pushing investors to come in and build on those brownfield sites. And what we've ended up with is, with that being cancelled and with that being taken away, we were unable to continue with that programme. So the government itself has got a lot to answer for in terms of what should have been put in place. So what we actually need, and we'll talk about solutions later, is what we actually need is something like, or a programme like housing market renewal, to come in, and we need real investment. What we're finding at the moment is that we're getting opportunities to bid for funding, and we're bidding against our own local neighbours and other districts and councils in our own areas who, if we're successful, they then suffer as a result of us being successful with some of our bids. And I think that is something that we're being pitted against each other. And what we need to also recognise is obviously that if that investment was there in terms of a lot of our housing, the housing stock in places like Burnley, places like Pendle, and much of those parts of Lancashire that have been mentioned, it would look very, very different. So and I think it's important that we outline that. So I'll just stop there, so that obviously other speakers might want to come in as well, and then obviously if there's any questions on what are the answers to that.
Great, thank you very much indeed. I remember a few years ago we were had the delight of being in Burnley for a couple of days with some of your officers, and one of the issues that we were exploring and looking at was the housing market renewal areas and what had gone on and what was still left to do. And obviously the stopping of that prematurely, I think, as you said, has had some problems. So we can definitely come back to that. But Zoe, let's move to you. Obviously, you're looking at and on the receiving end, I guess, in some respects, of people more and more concerned about how they make ends meet. So it'd be interesting just to get a scale and how that has evolved and changed over the period. And again, if you can say anything about whether there's a geography to that, if you're seeing more from some places than others, that would be equally fascinating as well. But over to you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me to join you today. So for people on this webinar who might not be aware, that Citizens Advice we are the statutory representative for consumers in the energy market. And today I'm coming at this sort of predominantly from that sort of energy space, given that energy is driving up a lot of the costs around the cost of living crisis. What that means is that we represent consumers today and in the future when it comes to energy policy. We also monitor energy companies and check they're doing what they should be doing against the rules, and also highlight any concerns that we see early on. We also provide first tier advice through our local offices and online and via telephone to consumers, and that's usually issues and concerns around their energy supply. I thought what might be useful for me to share is some additional context from our own data and what we're seeing. And I'm also going to do a bit of a plug, is that Citizens Advice do a monthly cost of living briefing, where our chief executive will tell you all what we're seeing from our data from the previous month. So
fantastic.
So what we've been seeing is that at the end of September of this year, we've helped over 155,000 people with crisis support, and that's a 54% increase on the same period last year. Also, by the end of September, we'd helped nearly 170,000 people with energy issues this year, which is more than the entirety of last year. We supported over 56,000 people with energy debts, and that's a 21% increase on the same period last year. A 93% increase on last year as a whole, and a 61% increase in 2019. And we've seen a big rise in the average energy debt owed by people, so up from around £350 in 2019-2020 to £650 energy debt in the last quarter. So that's before even the latest price rises. And another sad record that we seem to be breaking is that we see a record number of people who can't afford to top up their prepayment meter, and that's the 8th time this record has been broken in the last 9 months. And also we've seen more people in that situation this year than the whole of the previous 3 years. So that gives you some idea of the scale and what we're seeing. And just to kind of refer to a few things in the presentation, people may or may not be aware, we know that energy efficiency in homes is a massive problem in this country, and we are seeing increased numbers of people come to us about energy efficiency, and that's not traditionally what people will contact us about at Citizens Advice. And we've done a report called Insulation Nation. We released that a few weeks ago, and we found that the inefficiency penalty is costing householders on average an extra £350 a year on their bill. And if you're in the worst, most drafty housing, you could be paying up to £1,000 more a year on your energy bill, and that's massive. And to speak to the geography of that, when looking at the housing stock, out of the 10 worst constituencies for household energy efficiency, 6 of them are located in either Wales or the West Midlands. Out of the 10 best, 8 of them are located in, unsurprisingly, London and the South East. So it speaks exactly to what Guilherme was just talking about there. And to give you an idea of what consumers are telling us around, because we see a lot of talk about investing in energy efficiency, we found on average, so before the April price rise, on average, people had just £312 left after paying all their essential expenses. Since the rise, we estimate that's reduced to £210, but there's big differences demographically speaking. So disabled people tend to have just £120 left to pay for other things, and those renting have only £88 left after paying all those essential bills. So that's why we've really been calling for the need for greater investment into energy efficiency programme one that will help those households who are just about managing, not just those who are already eligible for support via the eco schemes and the hug schemes. We need to see something much wider, because as we've already alluded to, this problem is only going to get much worse, and energy efficiency is one of the surefire ways in which we can not only help householders save money, but it's also really good, for the economy, for creating more jobs and wealth across the country, rather than just concentrated in one place, and to really help build up that sort of national workforce around energy efficiency and net zero.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Zoe. I'll go to Paul in a second. I'm just curious, Zoe, have you noticed in the stats an increase in the queries or questions around energy efficiency, and how, since it's always been an ambition, but have you seen the sort of queries around from households or from people about how they can become more energy efficient through whatever means? Has that gone up as well?
Yeah, it has. Yeah, so we will, in our next cost of living briefing, due I think early next month, we have just started to expand our data to look specifically at that, because we noticed that more people coming to our local offices or contacting us to ask about ways in which they could save energy and make their homes more energy efficient. I've actually got a meeting tomorrow. We're going to dive into that data a bit more to understand what that's telling us. So hopefully, if people are interested, they can come along to our next briefing and we'll be able to give a bit more insight into that.
Brilliant. Well, if you share the details of when the briefing is, and we'll make sure that, as well as your own channels, we'll push that out to get as many people there as possible.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Let's turn to Paul. Just build on what we've heard, but also re-emphasize some of the points that Guilherme was making earlier on as well.
I think what's really interesting and striking from what Guy has found in the work that we've put out is, not only is there a geography to what's going on, but actually the policy response is completely blind to this. I think it's interesting that yesterday the new Chancellor, the latest Chancellor, rode back to some degree in terms of support being offered, and that support will still be there until April next year for everybody in terms of what was put in place. But then all of a sudden we're going to see some difference in terms of how that's applied and some criteria applied to it. I think a key thing to that should be about energy usage of houses, and particularly to understand the geography of that. So I think what we would like to see is having the scheme tailored, that those people that are in the most energy inefficient houses are the ones that are given the greatest support, which will then benefit places like Burnley more, say, than a place like Cambridge, for example, in order to make sure that this scheme is giving people the support that they need, given the squeeze that they're getting. Of course, the issue there is that, or the reason why we say this is a short-term response, is clearly in the longer term, we don't want to be in a position where we're subsidising demand to consume energy. And clearly the policy response has to then be about how to try and make these houses more efficient, so we don't have this geography that we observe now. But clearly, where we are currently, we're not going to be able to turn around that retrofitting problem within 3 months or 6 months, and so we are going to have to see, or we think that policy bit support being tailored to deal with that problem. But we've picked out the top 5 and the bottom 5, and it seems the top 5 are dominated by places with B. That is clearly a fluke, Glasgow being the only one that isn't. But if you look across the top 10 or the top 15, you would see that this is a problem that is while everywhere is being squeezed, a problem that's particularly squeezing cities and large towns in the north of England, and that then has all sorts of broad implications then about the impact on the economy, about what's going on in terms of spending on the high street, what's going on in terms of other elements of economic activity, where we might then start to see not only this cost of living squeeze being harder in certain parts of the country, but then an economic squeeze, which we may already be entering into, being sort of the hardest in the places that were weakest in the first place. And what that then tells us is that, the levelling up agenda, we don't tend to say the words levelling up very much anymore since the change of leadership, but it tells us that it's more important than ever. That the reason why, in part, these places are being hit harder is because people have less money in their pockets, because their economies are less prosperous. And if we are going to try and make sure that these places are more resilient to the next crisis that comes along and the crisis after, we do need long-term investments. Now, part of that is about very specifically around retrofitting, but actually some of it's about more generally about how we're going to use public investment to try and stimulate private investment to get these economies going. And I haven't seen, I think, on both fronts, much sign of that from the current government.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. So I'm going to try and organise it very loosely into two sort of sections or two buckets. Maybe start with you, Councillor. One is what can be done, what more needs to be done, and who needs to do it in relation to helping people and places through the short term. Through the immediate coping crisis. What is it that we need to do more in order for people to get through the winter and such, and through into the other halfway through 2023? And then if that's bucket one, and similarly you get some reflection from you, Zoe, on that, and then I think there's a second question which is related, obviously, and they're not mutually exclusive, which is what do we now need to put in place today in order to have some of those medium-term effects, whether it's housing stock retrofitting, or actually improving public transport systems in places like Burnley so people can get around without being reliant on the car, etc., etc. But just hold on bucket one for now, Councillor. Just give us a sense as to how Burnley Council are helping people deal with it in the short now. What more support would be helpful? And I'll get Zoe and Paul to come in on that perspective as well.
Yeah, thank you for that, Andrew. Yeah, I think in terms of what Burnley Council are doing, and again, just going back to the support we provided, especially over the past 2 years during the pandemic, we were one of only 6 councils right across the country that actually gave out more support to our local businesses and communities than what we received in grant funding from the government. And that just goes to show, one, the efficiency and the way that we responded to that pandemic and ensuring everybody got the support, especially those who were most vulnerable in terms of what they needed. But secondly, I think in terms of what it was touched on there, what Paul said about the policy response, I think the first thing that the government need to commit to in the short term is that recommendation that's been made in the report, which is that the universal credit and benefits have got to increase in line with inflation. Otherwise, those who are most vulnerable, those who are going to struggle the most, are going to be left worse off. And that's something that I think has definitely got to happen. Again, we're talking about policy, and it did make me smile when I'm losing count of the number of chancellors that we've had in the past 3 or 4 months. It seems to be a new one each time we speak. But already we're hearing that that energy price guarantee that the Prime Minister kept referring back to as the thing that they were making sure that would be delivered. All of a sudden, the new Chancellor is actually backtracking on that and saying that will not be there, going forward. It will only be there till April, and then it'll be something else coming in. And also already we're hearing announcements of the fact that there will be, cuts to public services as well, and some of the things that are coming out. Who gets hit hardest? It's those who are most vulnerable, those who are on lowest incomes, and in our case, it's those who live in some of our most deprived areas, and particularly around the housing. Biggest costs are going to always be fuel and energy, and so the vast majority of their income will go on that. What ends up then happening is that it's actually the council, because we have limited budgets, there's only so much that we can do. So we're looking at the possibility of actually extending our council tax support for our most vulnerable and those on lowest incomes, to try and support them with that, to make sure that we can put money in the pockets of our residents, especially those who are going to struggle the most. But what then ends up happening is that actually it's the community voluntary faith sector who end up picking up the pieces, who end up having to do all of that. And that's why we're actually grateful that we, through the pandemic, set up the Burnley Together Hub, who is a collection of partners, voluntary, community, public and faith sector, who come together, and we're supporting all of our communities, whether that be through support for school uniforms, whether that be support with food banks, anything that we can do, advice and guidance, that's what we're doing. But it shouldn't always fall on the voluntary faith community sector. The government need to step up, and they need to do something in the short term to respond to this.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And the point you make there in part is distinguishing between providing money straight into people's pockets, as it were, in order for them to, to have more money available to them to deal with it, but also making sure that we're adequately supporting the infrastructure more broadly that can provide support and assistance and advice over and above, the financial benefits that individuals, obviously require in order to get through it. That's a good point. We'll maybe come back to that as well. Zoe, I guess similar question to you, since we've had quite a bit of support laid out by the government already. The headline is the energy price guarantee with some modifications, obviously, as Afrasiab was already saying, but nevertheless, it's there through the winter period, reasonably substantive. We're not sure whether benefits that next year will go up by inflation. The government hasn't committed to that. That leaves us in a shortfall where they clearly didn't go up, or they haven't gone up in line with inflation this year. So, I mean, what in addition would you want to see in the short run, either going directly into people's pockets or into the infrastructure to provide them with the support that they need?
Yeah, so of course we believe that the benefits operating should be maintained, because we're already seeing that people's debt is increasing across the board, and if we're not careful, that's only going to accumulate. So we think there does need to be more focus on what we're going to do about all this massive debt that is being accumulated as well at the same time. In terms of energy, we need to see energy companies sticking to the rules and making sure that debt repayment plans are set at an affordable level. We need to make sure that prepayment meters are only installed where it's safe to do so, and that means no more prepayment meters for people who need to use energy for medical equipment or where they have very young children in their home. And it also means that then the government has got to stand alongside the likes of Citizen Advice and other charities and Ofgem, ensuring that companies are complying with these rules and act urgently when they're not, because otherwise we're just saving ourselves a whole host of trouble for when we hit springtime and people start trying to get a hold of their debt, if you like. And we also need to start thinking about, well, what happens once this energy price guarantee comes to an end? We need to start reassuring people that there will be an answer after that. We've seen headlines today around £4,000 energy bills. At Citizen Advice, we've been doing a price support review, and that will have an interim report in November, and then a full report in the springtime next year about, well, what comes after the price cap. What do we need to ensure that the most vulnerable in our society can still afford to pay for their energy and get the energy that they need?
And presumably, we would all want to see some clarity on that sooner rather than later, right? Not in a sense, not waiting until we're well into through the winter before we get some further clarification on that, because presumably that will influence the way that people consume energy, through the winter, if they worry about a big cliff edge coming, as we move into spring. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's really welcome, isn't it, that they're going to get the Treasury to review the position, and I think that's absolutely what's needed. But as soon as they start to come to some conclusions, they do need to start communicating that with people. We also need to see a much greater focus on energy efficiency. Okay, it's limited what we're going to get done this winter, but we have the eco scheme, we have the hug scheme. Let's get cracking and making sure that our most vulnerable and people that genuinely are massively underheating their homes get that support.
Great. Councillor, I can come back to you for a second, and then I'll bring Paul in. One of the thoughts, or one of the questions we were pondering, is whether, if there was some more targeting of additional investment, either into poor energy efficient households or overly car reliant households, how would we identify them? How would we target them, as it were? I wonder whether, does the council, through your engagement with your communities, hold that kind of information? And if we were trying to target those energy efficient households, we would be able to identify them without literally, going street by street or house by house. I mean, what's the potential role for the council in helping such a scheme to be delivered?
Yeah, in terms of delivering something like that, as a council, we would have the information. As I mentioned before, 71% of our housing stock is terraced housing, 2 up, 2 down, vast majority of those. We've got social housing in there, so our largest social housing provider, Cllr, would have the information about some of those properties that they want to further develop and carry out some work on. And then obviously through the data that we have around the indices of deprivation, some of those, our communities, we know our communities really well, and we know which of those, whether right down to street level data, that information is available, so we would know how to direct that. But I think, and again, this is something that we're doing medium term, but Cllr, our housing provider, is bidding for some money to try and retrofit 500 of their properties. But it's short-term thinking. It's relying on funding that might or might not happen. What we need is real investment, and the government actually committing to this, and that commitment through the policies that we're seeing at the moment, and actually what the government have actually taken away over the past 12 years, we're just not seeing that from them.
Yeah, no, that is a very good point. We've had quite a few questions on the allocation of funding mechanism, and the critique which I think everyone shares of the wastefulness of competitive bidding, where there's uncertainty on the process itself, there's uncertainty on the money available, and all of that, which just adds to complexity and actually wastefulness. Paul, just come back in and just re-emphasize the point, again, looking at that short run, the kind of things that we talked about, but we've also had several questions about, how this manifestation of the problem is layered on top of other problems. Kind of Zoe talked about, levels of debt. We've done some, and it's sadly that this is a story of places that were struggling already have now, further struggling. We see that through the pandemic. We saw that beforehand as well. So just remind, that slightly worrying picture that one thing adds on to the next, which makes recovery all the more difficult.
Yeah, it's a really good point, actually, Andrew. And I think it's something that has been missed from the debate, is that where were people in terms of their financial position going into COVID? And we did some work on this, as you say, the pandemic hit. And what we saw again was that there was no self-divide in this respect. If we looked at the amount of debt that people had relative to their incomes, we saw that they were much higher in places in the north of England in general than in towns and cities in the south of England. And what that meant was that going into COVID, they went in, on average, people in the north of England went into the pandemic with a very much smaller financial cushion in order to buffer themselves from the COVID shock that was coming. I think when we look at things like the job retention scheme, it looks as if that was able to shield people from the worst of that. So I think their very small financial cushion will have been eroded even more, but it doesn't appear that I think it was made substantially worse, which was a great thing that was the case. But if we now sort of roll at the next crisis, I can quote our breath from the last one. It appears that those people are still in the same position, a very small financial cushion. We then look at how the cost of living crisis is playing out, and we see it as those places that have very high levels of debt relative to their incomes are the places where incomes are being squeezed even more. Little money they're put to start off with, what they have got there is then being squeezed to a greater extent. Then this amplifies the problem. And I think it takes us back to this point I was making earlier about that's why, the levelling up agenda, or whatever it is that we want to call it, the north-south divide, etc., is so important, is because it's trying to make these places, I think, more resilient to these shocks that come in, as well as trying to get them to make larger contributions to the national economy as well. And I think the lack of vision potentially from the current leadership within government, given that we only wrote a white paper on this in February, is somewhat concerning. And it means that we're likely to continue to be talking about, these places struggling when the next crisis comes, and the next crisis comes after that. I think it's the lack of short-termism around this, which is short-term policy. I think we're concerned about what you talked about today, but also it's that lack of longer-term vision about what it is that we're going to do to try and insulate people and places from these things when they come to hit us.
Great. Okay, that's really helpful. So let's move on to sort of bucket two, as I sort of suggested, which is we're here in the here and now, and we talked about kind of role of particularly cash injections into households and into support infrastructure would make material difference in the short run. Think about some of that medium term activity. I suppose, Councillor, a question for you, I suppose, is if you were given the green light, or if one was given the green light to to think seriously about housing retrofit as a kind of program of continuous investment, how quickly could you get started on that? And secondly, what would that program look like? I mean, how how would that roll out in your mind, you know, if you were given the green light to proceed?
Well, with regards to how quickly can it be rolled out, or what would that? This is something that we should not be talking about today in 2022. It this is a conversation that should have been happening 5-10 years ago, but the government has just decided that they were going to ignore this, and now we're facing this crisis all of a sudden. It's we're going to start to roll this out and drip feed it in as if this is the solution. In terms of, are we ready to do that? We would need one, investment in that, but also in terms of getting ready for that, just simply because there's just been a lack of investment and lack of education that's been coming from government around this, about educating our communities and the impact of it and the benefit of it. I think one thing that would make us ready for it is that we're one of the authorities that we adopted our local plan back in 2018, so we know which of those areas, those brownfield sites, which of those areas that we want to develop and where it fits in with that housing need. So we would anything like that we would welcome straight away, and we would be wanting to run with that. But what we need the government is to do is recognise the fact that that is the way that they need to go. The policy that's coming from the government that we've heard and that has really shocked us here in Lancashire is that in their desperation to tackle this issue of cost of living, the government thinks that the answer to it is fracking, and that just says it all in terms of where this government stands. And it, you know, it's one of those moments you're thinking, really, that is our answer. We're talking about, you know, moving away from those kinds of fuels and making sure that we can go green, and the government in their desperation is saying that the answer is fracking, and especially here in Lancashire after, you know, the incidents that we had before it was closed down, it was stopped. The other thing, I think, you know, just to refer back to the point that was made by Paul in terms of levelling up, and we're not allowed to call it levelling up because even the government have, you know, said that they're not. That's something that's definitely not happening anymore.
Levelling up in a conservative way is what they've said. Yeah. They haven't defined what that actually means.
Yeah,
I rarely give anybody the benefit of doubt, but I'm just going to, just because it's a sunny day, at least where I am, I'm going to say levelling up with a conservative. In the conservative way, whatever. So
the conservative way of levelling up, or whatever it is, even that has not worked, because when we looked at the slides that were presented to us earlier, that gap between the north and south it's there, it's stark, it's there hitting you in the face in terms of the impact of 12 years of austerity have had on the north, and that north-south divide has just got bigger. And the other thing is, in terms of levelling up, what we're actually talking about is that they kept referring to levelling up, but what we we get this question here in Burnley. We were one of those local district councils that applied for levelling up funding because we had projects that were part of our canal side and town centre master plan that were already in place, and we could hit the ground running. So our bid was actually successful. We keep reminding, well, you've had levelling up money, but it's actually placemaking. It's actually about investment in places, making our places in terms of some of the projects that we've got. So in reality, it's not levelling up. What levelling up is actually investment in education and skills, investment in people. And that is something that this government doesn't recognise is what actual real levelling up is. And that's where they're not seeing it. So
that's a great point. It's an excellent point around not only the winning of the money, but what money gets allocated.
And if I can just add though, also in terms of the funding, it's, you know, these are in comparison to what we had in the past. I mentioned before, we had up to £20 million a year in terms of just for housing market renewal. This is £20 million, but we've had to put in match funding, and partners have had to put in contributions. And when we're talking about the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, we're actually talking about a 40% decrease in parts of Lancashire from in comparison to what was already previously in place. So you know, that's the reality of it, and that's what, again, some of the you know, government do not recognise. They'll have sound bites, they'll have these slogans that they'll be carrying, but in actual fact, when you look deeper, it's actually less. And what we're asking for is, our ask is actually just give us back what you took away.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair. Zoe, your reflections or kind of thoughts on, I guess, the medium term. I say it don't have to be mutually exclusive, but when we think beyond the very short term crisis horizon, what is it that what is the policy response? And who needs to be involved in it, I suppose, to try and mitigate the crisis as is, but also, you know, that we're not in this position come 12, 24, whatever it is again in the future.
Yeah, so as Citizens Advice, we're advocating for what we're calling a Great British Energy Efficiency Scheme. There needs to be a really bold programme of work to deliver energy efficiency across the nation. Anwar's absolutely right. It should have been done 10. In fact, when I first started working on energy 20 years ago, we were doing this stuff, and we were doing it to a higher degree, a lot more homes. So we need to get back there. We need to be delivering it across all different types of households. We need to be considering how we tackle some of the harder to treat homes. So specifically those with solid wall, they could be inner city, they could be actually more rural than non-traditional homes. We need to just have a real bold programme where we literally do go door to door, street to street. I think one of my colleagues, we called it a Marshall Plan for energy efficiency. And I think the current situation demands nothing less than that. And then with regards to energy prices specifically, as I've already said, we do need to have a really clear idea of what is going to happen beyond the price cap. And this isn't just about the cost of living crisis. This was always going to happen. We're always going to have to review the price cap and how energy prices are set, and how we can best make sure that it encourages people who have the money and perhaps are a bit more profligate with their energy use, how it encourages them to reduce demand, but then how it allows those people who need a certain set level of demand, maybe because they do have medical equipment or vulnerable people in the home, making sure they get their fair share. So we really do need to see a proper whole-scale review of how we set energy prices and how we protect those people in more vulnerable circumstances as well. And that's kind of our medium to long-term goals.
And have you done work or have done some thinking on what the balance should be between the consumer on the one hand and state on the other, and the industry, in terms of some of the ambitions or the aspirations to significantly reduce energy efficiency in the housing stock, for example? Have you done work as to what the balance should be between the consumer versus or consumer, state and industry? And I guess, in somewhere like Burnley, where housing values are lower than they are in, say, other parts of the country, I guess the balance would need to be, recalibrated. But what's your thinking on that, Zoe?
Yeah, so we still need to do that next stage of sort of finance work. But our initial thinking is that, people who are on lower incomes and literally don't have any money left in the pot at the end of the month, they should be offered full grants to be able to make their homes as efficient as possible. And then you could see a world where you have like sliding scales, depending on your income and your circumstances, you get sort of a contribution, and then the rest you put towards it. And that, honestly, that always used to be the case. You used to have, let's say Scottish Power knocking on your door saying, we can do your capital one installation for £99. So they would fund most of it, and then the householder would fund a bit of it as well. So I think we need to get back to that world where there's a bit more balance, and then on the real high end where people can afford to do it and can afford to invest in their properties, there should be some good low cost, let's call it green finance for want of a better word, available to people so they can use that to improve their properties. But there are also other policy levers you could have. Stamp duty, land tax. You can play with that a little bit so that actually it's more cost effective for someone to improve a property, because it would attract a lower rate of stamp duty when they sold it. So there's various, clever things you can do with policy to help kind of nudge those people who can afford it to make those improvements. And
you've said in the short run, you've seen the queries around energy efficiency gone up quite considerably. Does that mean that, in a sense, there's a general uplift in interest around that, or is that just a reflection on sort of the crisis position that we're currently in?
So I think it's possibly a bit of both, but I think majoritively it will be it has focused people's mind, hasn't it? People who don't normally have to worry about whether they switch the heating on are thinking twice, myself included, thinking twice about it. Well, do I need to, or do I need to put a jumper on? So I think a lot of it is driven by the current situation, and also what we're seeing is people coming to use our services and ask those questions and other questions around income maximisation that never dreamed they would have to call us. In fact, they are genuinely surprised that they find themselves either on the phone with us or at our door, our local office. So it's not, don't think it's a certain subset of people that are struggling. It's really wide.
Yeah, no, that is a very good point. We had a query or a plea on in the questions from Vivian Sugar saying, "Don't forget us in Wales. Never forget. I would never forget Wales. Don't worry, Vivian. We focus a little bit on certain issues, not least because we have the leader of Burnley with us, and we've talked about that. But if you look at the analysis that we've done, and I know you're referencing the Bevan Foundation's brilliant work on this as well, these are problems that play out across the country, and particular in communities where the housing stock is weaker and the public transport system is weaker as well. So, Paul, just build on that, because we've talked understandably around housing, particularly in energy consumption in relation to housing, but not exclusively. But the point that we make and the point you were making is it's a broader agenda. One of the issues we know drives increasing inflation and cost in somewhere like Burnley and somewhere like Swansea is a relatively poor public transport system, which is a kind of, which again, that's not immediately fixable, but it is something that we should aspire to and look to improve. And there's questions about making places walkable at least, or at least, not less reliant on the car, is part and parcel of how we progress in the medium term.
Well, definitely. I think if you look at the reason why certain places aren't being hit quite so hard is we're basically running the experiment that I think the question was suggesting, which is, should we try to make places more walkable? Well, actually, or more use of public transport. Well, London in particular is like that, and Cambridge to a certain extent is like that as well, because we've made decisions, perhaps inadvertently, around density, which are then encouraged. They support public transport because there are more people literally close to the stop to then sustain the network. Supports walking and cycling, because actually it is easier to do that because you're travelling shorter distances, because you've got more things in one place because of that density, as well as then policies coming in to disincentivise use of the car as well, like congestion charging in the centre of London, like the ultra-low emission zone to some extent as well within London too. So you've got sort of the carrot and the stick on this, but very much how we build our places is a really important part of not only how we tackle climate change and air pollution, but also how we deal with the cost of living crisis as well, about how we try and get people out of their cars, or this cost of living crisis, I say at least anyway, about how we then try and get people, that reduced demand to use petrol in the same way that we're talking a lot today about trying to reduce demand to use gas and electricity as well. So I think that element is really important. Part of that comes down to our planning policies and how we're able to do that. I think the planning system is the way it's set up currently probably doesn't really encourage that sort of thing. And we've done a lot of work on setting out how we would try to change that. But it probably is also worth sharing one thing about planning policy, how it affects this agenda in particular, about generation of electricity. And there was a case very recently of a solar farm. Now they've been in the news, fracking v solar farms. Quite interesting how the government has pitched its position that in recent weeks. This one solar farm got granted permission to cover a certain amount of area. But what was interesting is that the planning permission was for the solar farm to generate a certain amount of energy. Now, what that then meant was that if your solar farm becomes more efficient in the future, and you probably end up covering less space because you've got more, because you've got better performing solar panels, the application meant that you couldn't actually install those new panels without going through planning permission again, because you'd then go over the cap about how much energy could be generated. And that seems very silly in the context of this cost of living crisis, cost of living crisis and the net zero crisis, which is why we've got policies in place that actually are disincentivizing people to use better technology to try and generate the electricity that we need. I think it's another sort of insight into how the planning policy really bites in this area, and something that we need to think about. How do you address that? How do you have a more consistent planning policy, not only to get these things to work better, but actually to get the economy working better as well?
Great, thank you very much for that. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I just want to get your reflections on, maybe come to you first, Councillor. We are promised I don't know if it's the third or whatever, more than one, considerably more than one, maybe 3 or 4 economic statement in a couple of weeks or time from the Chancellor, if he's still there, on setting up more detail with the OBR, etc., etc. But in this sort of space, and more generally just thinking about Burnley moving forward, what is it that you would ideally want to be looking for or see in the budget, let's call it that makes real the commitment that the government has made around supporting places that have been struggling and households that have been struggling, and particularly explicitly those that are struggling the most. I mean, the new Chancellor was very explicit on that in his interview on the Today programme early this week, that all his policies would support those that are most vulnerable. So just what will you be looking for? We've got the spectre of public investment cuts to come in order to balance the books. But I mean, what will you be looking for from a Burnley point of view? And I get Zoe to give it from her view as well.
I think not only just from a Burnley point of view, but I think generally, I think everybody will be looking at what can we do to help our most vulnerable, those will be hardest hit. And I think the first thing that the Chancellor can do is commit to actually raising benefits in line with inflation, and that's got to be the first step. If that doesn't happen, it just shows that they're out of touch and they're not serious about doing anything. And then there's other things that can be done longer term or maybe short term. So, for example, there needs to be investment for Homes England to be able to develop on brownfield sites and renew some of that housing stock which I spoke about before. And then the long term and it shouldn't be long term, it should have happened, as we said earlier on, is investment in in our homes and retrofitting, which is something that needs to happen. But if we're completely honest, and one of the things that needs to happen also, which the government keeps shying away from, is a windfall tax on those energy companies to actually pay for some of this, because the money's got to come from somewhere. But it just appears, again, that whole thing about the gap between the poorest and the richest, that gap between the north and the south is just getting bigger and bigger, and something needs. And if they can't do it, if they're out of touch and out of their depth, then the other thing that they need to do for places like Lancashire or Burnley is actually give the money to us, give us those powers to make those decisions, and we'll do it ourselves.
And presumably you wouldn't want to go through the competitive sort of funding route, which now seems to be, the default system for allocating monies of different types of, different sizes. Like we'll go through some competition for X and competition for Y and such. But actually to find a way where, places are getting money on a more certain basis, maybe on some kind of formula basis, that at least you can have some sense as to what to expect, what's coming your way. Is that right?
Yeah, I think whatever happens, we need to move away from what I call this bidding bingo, or this lottery of applications, because effectively what you're doing is you're if you're better off, somebody else down the road is worse off and not benefiting, and they've got the exact same problems that we've got. When you look at Lancashire. But I think I read in the comments that the previous traditional systems that were in place in terms of the formulas, they didn't quite work out as well. Well, the answer to that is actually, the government should know, we know in our local communities where that targeted support needs to go. So work with us to actually target all of that, and that can be done up and down the country. It's straightforward.
Very good. Okay, Zoe, what should we keep our eye out for on October the 31st, when the Chancellor stands up to make another set of announcements?
Well, unsurprisingly, I agree with Anwar. The biggest thing that this government can do to make a difference is to maintain that benefits up rating. That's got to be critical if they're going to put their money where their mouth is and stand by people who are really struggling the most. And secondly, and there's probably a big ask, is we just need to see investment in energy efficiency, a really bold programme that is properly targeted, exactly as Anwar was saying, so that it goes to those homes that are the least efficient, regardless of where they are, so we can avoid this sort of postcode lottery of money going to the people. It's not always necessarily the places that deserve it more. It's that if they've got a really good system in place for bidding this money and they know how to get it, it doesn't necessarily follow that it always goes where it should. So there is plenty of data out there. We should use that and properly target our energy efficiency scheme to those people and places that need it the most.
Great. And the final thought from you, Paul, on what we should be looking for on a week Monday time?
So I agree with I think almost everything that's just been said. So just to build on the point that Zoe said there, first one thing we're looking for is a credible long-term programme of retrofit. So setting out a 10-year programme. We had the Green Deal a few years ago, it started then stopped. That caused all sorts of issues about getting suppliers involved. They weren't getting paid, so private companies weren't coming forward. Just put some longevity to this, put some money behind it, put some longevity to it to give that certainty, to get businesses to come in and start providing the retrofitting that we need. And the second one, I think, is a clear plan about public investment to try and deal with improving performance of the economies of places outside the Greater South East. So we've had a lot of noise about public spending cuts. We've gone very quiet on the levelling up white paper. Started a plan about how we're going to get the economy going in these places, get it growing, and growing sustainably, as opposed to sort of the struggles that we've seen that these places have had for 30, 40 or 50 years. And very clear, this won't be done only through regulation. It needs to be backed with public money to then get in private capital. If you don't have that public money coming in first, and the private capital continue not to come in. So investment plans, please, about trying to improve the economies of places outside the Greater Southeast. Excellent, great, thank you very much. And it's bang on 3 o'clock, so we need to finish. Huge thanks to my panel, Councillor Anwar, to Zoe Guijarro and Paul Swinney. Thanks to you for joining, posting your questions and comments. Much appreciated as always. You can get we had quite a few queries about where you can get the information, the report, the slides, and all our work on cost of living is on our website, centreforcities.org/cost of living. So you should find everything that you need there. But again, until the next time, take care and stay safe. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.